Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Today, with the Prime Minister in America, we devote the show to two key issues he faces at the moment. It's now common knowledge that the Prime Ministers of India and Pakistan are not just in the same city, but staying in the same hotel. Given the poor state of the relationship, is this not an opportunity they should grab to meet and talk about their problems? Or are they wise to ensure that even their paths don't cross? That's the second discussion tonight. But first, we should examine the prospects of India and the rest of the G4 obtaining a permanent Security Council seat and ask, is tomorrow's G4 summit just a high-profile meeting without the likelihood of a meaningful outcome? It's the first time the Prime Ministers of Japan and India, the Chancellor of Germany and the President of Brazil will meet since 2004. Their intention is to focus on their demand for a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. But what are their chances of success? To answer that question, I'm joined by two former Foreign Secretaries. They are Lalit Mansingh, who also served as Ambassador in America, and Kanwal Sibal, who also served as Ambassador in Russia. And with them is India's former High Commissioner to Pakistan and South Africa, and a former Deputy Permanent Representative at the United Nations, Satyabrat Pal. Lalit Mansingh, the G4 heads of government are going to hold a summit in New York tomorrow morning with the intention of pursuing their collective ambition of securing a permanent United Nations Security Council seat. Looking at it realistically, what are their chances of success?
Well, chances of success are not very bright, but I think the fact that they're meeting is going to raise the profile and keep the issue alive. So if you're not rejecting the idea of ever joining the Security Council, it's best to keep it in the news, and someday it might happen.
And in your eyes, this is a credible and effective way of doing just that?
Well, G4, the G4 are four powerful countries, leading powers of the world, aspirants for permanent membership, and I think their meeting is significant.
Mr. Pal, India sets a lot of store by the text that the United Nations General Assembly has accepted. As someone who's been a Deputy Permanent Representative, how do you view that text, and how meaningful and how significant is it?
You know, the text that was adopted on the 14th of September is simply a collation of views expressed by member states, and which they have expressed for over a decade now. All it does is put it together in one document, not in conference room papers, but as a document attached to a General Assembly decision. But it is not something on which you can begin negotiations. To do that, you have to have a draft resolution. So if tomorrow the G4 summit decides to move on towards drafting and presenting such a resolution, a draft resolution, then of course there would be progress. But what was adopted on the 14th of September in itself means nothing.
What was adopted on the 14th of September means nothing?
Very little.
Kanwal Sibal, let me add to what you've heard from Satyabrat Pal. For all that they've told India separately that they support India's bid to become a UN permanent member of the Security Council, both Russia and America provided no inputs to this document that the General Assembly hasn't accepted. China is clearly ambivalent. Secondly, China clearly doesn't want Japan as a member. Thirdly, there's no real appetite for another European member to join on a permanent basis the Security Council. And finally, Brazil is today a weakening rather than a strengthening country. Now, when you see all of that put together, does that suggest we've got credible prospects? Or is this just one more step amongst many that we're taking, but there's no real light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, a few points. So one is that it's quite right that the negotiating text is not a right document on which any serious discussion can take place. On the other hand, many members of the P5, especially China and Russia, opposed even the decision on the negotiating text because they felt that this will break the wall that they have already created in the open and the working group to prevent any serious discussions on expansion and reform. So the fact that they employed so much of their diplomatic capital to oppose this move suggests that they do see it as some forward progress. Number two, the G4 countries are the only ones which have formally announced their candidature for permanent membership of the Security Council. African countries have not yet done so, no one else has done so. The fact, therefore, that those who are the most visible aspirants are getting together to see what they can do collectively to move forward this process is important, and it will depend on what decisions they take. Number three, I think it will be a bit premature for them to move a resolution at this stage because there is not yet enough discussion and consensus building on the so-called negotiating text, and it will run into huge trouble. But I think after some time, when the views have crystallized more, then yes, then G4 or with the Africa group, by which time hopefully they would have decided who the African candidates are, could move a draft resolution based on their assessment that they will get 2/3 majority. But any decision now would be premature.
I'll quickly put a question to you, Satyapal, before I go to Mr. Mansingh, because you know the functioning of the UN, having been Deputy Permanent Representative there. The G4, it said, are hoping that they can get the General Assembly to pass a 2/3 resolution with the belief that a resolution backed by so many would be very difficult for the P5 to veto or reject. How likely, A, is a 2/3 resolution out of the General Assembly, and B, even if they get it, will it be then so solid that the P5 can't veto it?
No, it's a question of whether the veto doesn't apply in the General Assembly. What this means is that to have a charter amendment, the charter has laid out that it needs the ratification of all permanent members, which means that even if it is passed by a 2/3 majority, it does not become a charter amendment until all 5 have ratified according to their own procedures. To say that China, for instance, or Russia, or even the United States will agree to ratify because a 2/3 majority has passed it, I think is being at the moment quite optimistic.
Now, on the other hand, Mr. Mansingh, the G4 have put a lot of effort into this meeting. For one, there hasn't been a G4 heads of government meeting since 2004. That's 11 years. Secondly, the Japanese Prime Minister, I'm told, is flying in specially for this. Thirdly, all the heads of government are making themselves available at 8 o'clock in the morning so that Mr. Modi can then fly to California. Does all of that suggest that maybe they have an ace up their sleeves that we haven't as yet found out about?
No, I think it's a realization that this idea was dormant. Perhaps this is the time to revive it. And I'll tell you why I think this is a good time to do so. People are talking about China. Now, China has visibly weakened after we saw the chinks in China's armor in terms of its economic problems.
Chinks in China's armor is a rather clever way of putting it.
Okay. We've seen Japan's clout increasing, and their Prime Minister Abe is moving resolutions to the Diet which will suggest that Japan is working towards having a more effective defense force, and China is worried about it. The Germans are undoubtedly the leaders of Europe today. We've seen that. And the Brits might well quit the European Union, we don't know that. So I think the momentum is now in favor of these 4 states, and therefore it's a good time to revive it and sort of set the ball rolling.
On the other hand, Kamal Sibal, one of the problems is that already countries like the Americans think that the Security Council is unwieldy and the membership is only 15 at the moment. And what we're talking about is not an increase of 2 or 3, but very possibly an increase that could go all the way up to 25 once the Africans and all the others are taken on board. Would a Security Council of 25 members be acceptable to any of the P5? Because potentially that sounds as if getting a decision out of it would be very difficult.
Well, I think to the best of my knowledge, France and the UK are on board. They are not objecting to a larger Security Council than what the United States are willing to accept. The US wants to limit it to 21, which is totally impractical because it will not include the G4 and the necessary numbers of non-permanent seats that are required to satisfy others. So the US proposal is a non-starter. China, it's not very clear at the moment, but I don't think they would necessarily oppose a larger Security Council. Russia, yes, Russia would not be very happy because to their thinking, the enlargement of the Security Council means a diminution of the powers of the existing P5 members, and Russia is already on the defensive. And if Germany and Japan were to be included in the Security Council as permanent members, then Russia has a problem in terms of balance between the Security Council, between their interests and those of the West or the industrialized countries. I think the argument of the Americans will become unwieldy, and therefore the decision making would become less efficient, I think is a self-serving argument, because as of now, it's not as if the Security Council is working efficiently. Look at all the crises that we have around us, and the Security Council is unable to manage. Now, if you had buffers between the United States and Russia, which is a legacy of the Cold War, I think there are greater chances of a more efficient working of the Security Council, because it will be seen as being more representative of not only the existing power balance in the region, but because of better regional of the world, but because of better regional distribution, more representative of the people of the globe as a whole.
You know, one problem is this question about if you expand the Security Council to 25, does it become unwieldy and impractical? And you've heard Kapil Sibal sort of refute that, in fact, it would probably be a better council because it would be more representative. But on the other hand, you've got problems to begin with within the General Assembly, because there are a whole host of countries there who do not like the idea of either India going in or Japan going in or even Germany going in. There are Italians against the Germans, there are Pakistanis against the Indians. And then there are others who believe that simply the smaller countries won't get represented, and therefore why expand it at all? What are the chances that the General Assembly itself will be united in proposing anything like an expansion, whether it involves the G4 or others?
Well, I think after close to 2 decades of negotiations, there's a general acceptance that the Council needs to be expanded.
But with more, the Pakistanis say, non-permanent members rather than permanent.
By definition, 90% of the membership have no aspirations to be permanent members. Certainly, you cannot possibly have just an expansion of the permanent membership, because that would be completely unacceptable to the vast majority. So in order to get an expansion of the permanent membership, you have to have an expansion of non-permanent membership. How large is the question? Now, those are the issues that have been debated back and forth endlessly. And if you want to move forward, then I'm afraid you have to have a piece of paper. You cannot say that we are moving towards text-based negotiations and not have a text.
Absolutely. And all you've got is a compilation of different views from different countries.
Absolutely.
And those are contradictory of each other.
Absolutely.
So at the end of the day, what we are claiming is a significant text is actually nothing more than a collection of different views which are often contradictory of each other.
And which have been on the record for the last 10 years and more.
Let me put this to you. Nothing will happen if the Americans and the Russians are against it. They must be the 2 most important members of the Security Council as it exists today. Now, the Americans may on paper say that they support India's, but if you look at the track record, India frequently takes different stands from America on a whole host of critical issues. Won't America complicate things for itself enormously if India now becomes a permanent member with a veto on the Security Council? Because then they'd have to handle India's opposition to their views at a different level, which is more complicated.
No, but the Americans have gone through that debate. The fact that they opted to become strategic partners of India means that they have thought this through, that there will be occasions when India will differ from them. But when you have a strategic partnership, there is much more of understanding on strategic issues. So I don't think the Americans...
It hasn't emerged as of now.
Well, I think the Americans have realized that on basic issues, we have agreement. We may have disagreements on some of the bilateral issues, some multilateral
We have
issues.
huge disagreements on over the handling of ISIS, Syria, even Afghanistan.
Yeah, true. And there are major issues like climate change and so on.
Absolutely, and those are all basic issues.
But when you have Indian and American leaders meet, you find that there is a very large area of consensus.
But those are all bilateral.
Not all bilateral. There are a lot of multilateral issues. I think on climate change, we made substantial moves towards coming to each other's positions. So I think the Americans are not worried about India being an opponent in the Security Council. They see strength in India being there on their side.
Let me put like this, Kamal Sibal. If the best that can be offered to the G4 and we're going way, way down the road, so we're nowhere near that point as yet, but if the best that can be offered to the G4 is permanent membership but without a veto, would that be acceptable to India?
I think already within the G4 there have been discussions. I think Germany is willing to live without a veto, so would Japan. In case of Brazil, the former Brazilian president Luiz da Silva was not in favor of a new permanent member without veto powers. And India and others have actually more or less informally reached a consensus amongst themselves that even if they are given veto powers for 15 years, they will not use the veto. So some kind of an understanding can be reached. France is the only country amongst the P5 which has actually accepted India with veto powers. Britain has not. And I think other countries also, P5 countries, resist the idea of new members with veto powers. And I think even those in the General Assembly who favor expansion to include both permanent and non-permanent members are not in favor of the new members acquiring veto powers. So this is an open question, and push come to shove, of course, in terms of principle, you are creating two different levels of permanent membership, one with veto, one without a veto. Then the larger question that should be discussed is whether the existing P5 countries with veto powers should continue to have veto powers or not. Russia is absolutely adamant that they must have veto powers. It's a very complex subject. On the whole, I think this may not be a deal-breaking issue if India can get permanent membership.
Let me put it like this, Satyavrat, and this perhaps is a core question. Given the improbability of getting this document to become a resolution, given the opposition it could face within the General Assembly, then given the opposition it could face at the P5 level within the Security Council, and then at the end of the day you may end up without having veto powers and therefore looking like second-class permanent members rather than first-class ones. Is it worth India's while to give this matter the priority that we are giving it, to push so hard for it?
I think realistically, if you want to have the status of permanent membership now, to expect a veto to come with it would be completely silly, because there is almost a consensus that the veto should not be extended to new permanent members. So de facto, if you are pushing for permanent status now, you are accepting, as you said, a second-class status within the category of
Hence my
membership.
question, is it worth giving it the high profile we're giving it?
Well, we are committed, we have been committed to it for a long time, knowing that this is what, if we get it at all, is what we are likely to get. And for whatever reason, we have always felt, or seem to have felt for quite some time now, that it is worth our while to try to become permanent members.
So you think it is worth the high profile?
It is worth trying, certainly. But I don't think, well, the profile has been raised now, all of a sudden, with this G4 summit. But for the last 10, 11 years, it's been in the doldrums.
It's often been said to Indians, although never officially and certainly never on paper, that you'd have a better chance if you tried on your own. The G4 as a whole is unlikely to ever be admitted. Is there any possibility that the Quest could actually split the G4, and maybe Germany and India might get together to try on their own? Or maybe India and Japan. Japan, of course, is a problem country because China is almost adamantly opposed to it, rather than G4 continue as a unity.
Well, this is what kept the G4 apart in the last 10, 11 years. But now there's a realization that we have to get back together and work together on this. And there is merit in that, because when we combine our national strengths, it's quite a formidable force. Now, the question you asked earlier, is it worthwhile? I think it is worthwhile, because as the Prime Minister said, we should graduate from being a balancing power to be a leading power. And if you're a leading power, you have to be in the high tables wherever they exist in the world. Now, you've gone to the East Asia Summit, you've gone to G20. We are aspiring to join the multilateral nuclear groups. This is the only high table where we are excluded, and that's worth giving it a shot.
Councillor, the Prime Minister wants to be recognized as a leading power, not just an aspiring or emerging power. The truth is 30% of India live below the poverty line, and that's a very dubiously defined poverty line to begin with. 40% of our children are malnourished, and that's the highest percentage anywhere in the world. It's even higher than sub-Saharan Africa. Can we ever be really recognized and accepted as a leading power when those are the economic realities of our country?
Well, why not? You know, when China was given permanent membership, its development indices were lower than that of India. But the fact that China
wasn't that to do with the Second World War and the fact that Chiang Kai-shek at the time would have been the person who would have held the seat, and China's relationship was different?
No, what I meant is, what I mean is that it's not as if India is destined to remain at the level where it is. If China could grow, India can also grow. So why lay this condition beforehand that unless your GDP grows and you become as large an entity as China in economic terms, only then you will be eligible for permanent membership. So I think that's unfair, because there are certain parameters on the basis of which India just justified in being a permanent member, and those in terms of our demographic size, our human resource capital, despite all the problems that you mentioned, our geographical size, our military strength, our civilization, what we bring to the world in terms of our culture, etc., etc. And there are so many countries which look up to India in various ways. In terms of leadership, we have been a leader of the non-aligned movement when we had a much higher profile globally than perhaps we have now. So there's a history in terms of our role, even in the United Nations, in terms of decolonization, disarmament. So we have a very proud history. And in UN peacekeeping operations, we are one of the biggest participants. So what else is needed to justify our permanent membership?
The Prime Ministers of India and Pakistan are staying at the same hotel, the Waldorf Astoria in New York. Given the present state of poor relations, should they take the opportunity to meet and discuss their differences, or would that be unwise? My guests are former Foreign Secretary Lalit Mansingh, former Foreign Secretary Kanwal Sibal, and India's former High Commissioner to Pakistan, Satyabrat Pal. Satyabrat Pal, when the Indian and Pakistani Prime Ministers are going to be not just in the same city but staying in the same hotel, does it not make sense for the two of them to meet? And would it not be almost childish if instead they ensure that their paths simply don't cross?
You know, I've always argued for engagement with Pakistan. And I continue to believe that that's absolutely essential, unavoidable. But engagement means a continual engagement. It doesn't mean one-off events every 6 months and then a slanging match thereafter, or going into a prolonged fit of the sulks. At the moment, I don't see any real interest in India, certainly in India, in engaging with Pakistan. And if the Prime Ministers were to meet again in New York, I fear a repeat of UFA, that you would have something which would then be analyzed, dissected. Everyone would try to see if there were weaknesses, victories, defeats, and the whole thing would be a disaster.
So if I understand you correctly, in a situation where, and which is desirable, that you have continual meetings, it would be silly for the two, if they're in the same hotel, not to meet. But given that in fact you don't see the desire for further meetings and a desire for improvement on the part of the Indians, and we don't know about the Pakistanis, there's a danger that this one-off, if it happens, could lead to a goof up.
That's right.
Mr. Mansingh, given the poor state of our relations and the fact that they can only improve if they are nudged from the top, isn't there a duty and perhaps even a moral responsibility on the two Prime Ministers to make every effort to meet?
Well, I'll give you a mixed reply. I think that two countries and the two leaders should have opportunities to meet. But whether they should meet now in New York, I have 3 good reasons why they shouldn't meet in New York. Number one, they don't have an agenda. What they had to discuss, they discussed in UFA. And nothing much has happened since then. What they had decided has not been implemented. And therefore...
Isn't that itself an agenda?
Yeah, but you can't have... I mean, they asked for meetings, the meetings haven't taken place. The meetings should have taken place and the reports should have come to the leaders so that they could have a further meeting. That hasn't taken place. Number two, I suspect Mr. Modi has got a fair idea that he's talking to the wrong man. That you come to certain decisions with the leader on the Pakistani side, then you discover that he's actually not in charge. And therefore, talk to him again and face the same issue. Number three, I think it's fairly clear what Nawaz Sharif is going to say, because he has said the same things in New York every September, which is to attack India, bring up Kashmir and make allegations against India. Why would Mr. Modi expose himself to that?
In which case, Kamal Sibal, I know for a fact that you're against the two prime ministers meeting, even if they're staying in the same hotel. Do you think it makes sense for India to start a dialogue with the Pakistan Army Chief? Western countries have no inhibitions about talking to General Raheel Sharif. Up till now, India has believed that as a democracy, it would be not wrong to talk to an army chief. But given that Mr. Nawaz Sharif is not the right man, and given that we don't want to meet him, should we then start talking to Raheel Sharif instead?
No, this is a very complicated proposal, because if, for example, we had political level talks between the two prime ministers, and then it was decided that the army chiefs at some stage should sit alongside to have a more broad-based discussion, that can be envisaged at some future date. But this will presuppose that the Pakistan Army Chief will actually accept subordination to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and play second fiddle to him in formal talks with India. But we can't have separate military to military level talks, because the Pakistan Army is a highly political animal. They actually run the country insofar as the most crucial foreign policy issues are concerned. Whereas our army, as you well know, I don't have to say, is subordinate to the civil authority, and they can't take any political decisions on their own. Therefore, it will be a totally mismatched discussion between the two sides. Yes, at some future date, if the two army chiefs get together to discuss purely military issues.
I didn't mean army chief to army chief. Forgive me, I'm interrupting. I didn't mean army chief to army chief. I meant Narendra Modi to Raheel Sharif.
Why should he speak to him? Because
he runs the country.
Speak to the Prime Minister of Pakistan.
But if Raheel Sharif runs the country, and we believe that to be the case, then why let the illusion of protocol deter us from talking to the right man?
No. It's not the illusion of protocol. Formally, he is not formally running the country. There has been elections in Pakistan. Nawaz Sharif is the elected Prime Minister of Pakistan. Our Prime Minister is the elected Prime Minister of India. Neither the Army Chief of India nor the Army Chief of Pakistan are elected by their people. Therefore, the conversation has to be between the two political leaders. It's a different matter that the Pakistan Army runs the country, as it were, whereas the Indian Army does not. But insofar as the American example that you've given, it's because the Americans are dealing at all levels, and they are the mentors, they are the aid providers, they are the ones who can control the decisions of the Pakistani armed forces. They can, as they did with General Musharraf, that if you are not with us, we are going to bomb you to the Stone Age and things like that. We can't speak this language to the Pakistan army. So therefore, the equivalence between the way United States deals with Pakistan and its army general is not quite the same thing as India talking to Pakistan's army general.
Let me come back to your concern that a meeting at this point would end up being a goof up, and therefore it would be dangerous. I accept that there's always danger when the heads of governments of two countries that have a poor relationship meet, because the meeting could go either way. But isn't that part of being a statesman? Those are risks you have to take, because just because there's a danger the meeting could go badly doesn't mean that you should not make the effort to meet.
No, let me take you back to something you said in the first half about malnutrition, about the various other national problems that we face. Clearly, Pakistan is a major problem for India. How do we tackle the other major national problems, malnutrition being one of them? It's not something that you can solve with one meeting or one sporadic meeting at the level of the Prime Minister. It's something that you have to address, tackle every day at all levels in a variety of ways. Exactly the same way with Pakistan, you have to engage at all levels and tackle all aspects of the problem.
And do so continually?
Do so continually.
And do so without break?
That's right. And unfortunately, at the moment, there seems to be no appetite in India for that. There's not even an acknowledgement that is the only way to tackle and try to solve a national problem. And if you don't have that, just having a meeting would be as pointless as the Prime Minister calling a summit once every 6 months to discuss malnutrition.
You know, what he's really suggesting, Mr. Mansingh, is that the entire attitude with which we, from the Indian side, and I presume this applies to the Pakistanis, but I can't speak for them, approach the relationship is wrong. We should say to ourselves that we need to keep talking regardless of what happens, because we have to sort out the problem. In fact, when things go wrong, that should be a further spur to talking more. That attitude is missing. We in India tend to regard meetings with the Pakistan Prime Minister almost as a gift that we're giving him because the relationship is okay at the moment, rather than as a mechanism to improve the relationship and lift it to a different level.
No, I think it's slightly different. There is a continuous dialogue with Pakistan. We have official establishments, we have high missions, and official business is being carried on with Pakistan.
But the official business doesn't tackle the problems we have.
Yeah, and people-to-people exchanges, tourists, cultural exchanges, cricket matches, all that is going on.
Well, they get called off every time we in India get into a state of anger.
But by and large, those exchanges are not suspended. What has been suspended is what is called the dialogue, the composite dialogue. That's a structured dialogue. That is now not taking place. And that is because India, Pakistan go through a cyclical process, and we are seeing the end of a cycle. The composite dialogue has run its course. Mr. Modi wants a different form of dialogue. And I think he's find out how best he can do this with his own red lines attached to it. So there were two earlier red lines. He's attached a third one. The two earlier ones were what Dr. Manmohan Singh had said, demolish the infrastructure of terrorism against India, bring the perpetrators of the Mumbai outrage to justice.
And now Hurriyat.
And now Hurriyat. And he says, either me or the Hurriyat. Now, that, if Pakistan accepts, we can come back to another form of dialogue.
Let me bring you in on that point, because what actually India is doing is to come up with things that we are setting down as preconditions to a dialogue. First, it was, you mustn't raise Kashmir at the UN. Every time you raise Kashmir at the UN, we're not going to talk to you. And then we're saying now, you can't talk to Hurriyat if you want to talk to us, even though they've been talking to Hurriyat for 20 odd years. Is it right for us to set preconditions, and when these very things should actually be outcomes? As outcomes of dialogue, they could be acceptable to Pakistan, but if they become preconditions for the dialogue, we're asking Pakistan to change what has effectively been its traditional policy. But they can't change their policy as a precondition. They can possibly change it as an outcome.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And in fact, I've said as much in one of your shows earlier, that you're not talking to a defeated country. You're not talking to an enemy you've vanquished. You're talking to a country with whom you have to come to agreements. And those agreements will obviously be the product of negotiations. And you cannot have negotiations between equals that are predicated on preconditions laid down by one side. We might be infinitely the more powerful partner, or the negotiator of the two, but nevertheless, Pakistan is not someone we can compel to accept what we lay down as a precondition. And if I might just say that while of course there is this desultory interaction between the two countries, the real core issues are the ones that we are supposed to discuss in what we call the composite dialogue. Composite dialogue, you can call it anything else, but if those are not discussed, then clearly you are really tinkering at the edges. You aren't addressing the issue.
You know, Constable, the consequence of there being no dialogue is that there's also no forward movement in India-Pakistan relations. Now, that's not a punishment for Pakistan. They're happy to live with it. But it could presumably be a problem for us, because terror will continue and all the other problems that we face from Pakistan will continue. The only hope of those ending is dialogue. Refusing to talk is actually a form of self-inflicted punishment on ourselves, because we pay the price, not Pakistan.
Well, I don't buy that argument. Firstly, if Pakistan feels that they don't need a dialogue with India, then let's stop them better at that. There's no need to talk to them then. Number two, we have not laid down any preconditions. In fact, despite repeated terrorist attacks, we have come back to the dialogue hoping that Pakistan would see reason and stop using the instrument of terror against us. Time and again, we have suffered from terrorism. Time and again, without making it a precondition, even after the Mumbai terror attacks, we have gone into the dialogue mode with them. Number three, that it's not as if we've not had dialogue with them. We've been having dialogue with them since 1996. And if somebody can tell me at the end of the day, what is the concession that Pakistan has made to us, what has been the benefit that India has got from this dialogue, then I would say yes, there is much merit in continuing this dialogue. But in actual fact, on the core issues, there has not been at all any change in Pakistan's position. And therefore, if the dialogue is not going to result in any advantage to us and has not done so, I can't see why we feel that the dialogue is to our disadvantage.
I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to stop you there because I've got 30 seconds left. And Satyaprat Pal, who's been High Commissioner in Pakistan, is nodding his head in disagreement. Has the dialogue ever brought any advantage to India, or do you agree with Kamal Sibbert, who says it's brought no advantage, therefore why bother about it? Quickly, because I'm out of time.
I completely disagree because apart from anything else, if you look at what happens when dialogue collapsed and we went into the confrontation which led to Operation Parakram, independent data confirms that the impact on India was huge because India is integrated in the world economy, which Pakistan is not. Our trade, our tourism, our investments all suffered. We took a huge hit on our GDP. We took a huge hit on our growth. And if Mr. Modi's focus, priority is to develop India, then if things go haywire with Pakistan, all that will go.
Quite right. No dialogue means India takes the hit, and the hit hits our GDP, and that hits our growth, and that hits Make in India, and that hits Mr. Modi's plans to change the country. At the end of the day, the biggest gainer from dialogue, even if the dialogue doesn't produce results, is Mr. Modi, not Pakistan. But my thanks to all of you for coming. This is clearly a contentious issue. Unfortunately, Mr. Modi is not here to hear this advice from this panel. But if he were, perhaps he might understand that it's in his interest to talk, not just in Pakistan. My thanks to all my guests for joining me. Goodbye. Good night.